Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be starting a new design challenge, and I've decided to put together this Edpuzzle video to make it a little bit easier to interact, for you to provide some feedback, to do a little bit of brainstorming, and to ask any questions you may have about this design challenge. This is a little bit different than previous design challenges because it's going to be a little bit more of a large-scale project that will take several classes for us to complete. And because of that, we have some more in-depth criteria and constraints that we are going to review throughout this Edpuzzle video. So let's start things off by taking a look at what you will be creating. The design challenge is going to ask you to create a futuristic city. So we're going to be keeping on the same theme of clean, sustainable energy. For my 6th to 8th graders, we should be thinking about the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll be making some connections to those as we go through this design challenge. So first, let's talk about the design criteria. And again, these are the things that must be included or used in your design. So we have 8 of them. We'll talk about each one, and we'll pause the Edpuzzle video along the way for you to provide some feedback. So here's our first criteria. Your city must include at least 2 sources of sustainable energy. If we think back to before February break, you did a design challenge on solar panels or solar farms, as well as wind turbines. So those are 2 different forms of sustainable energy. As we are moving forward throughout this project, we'll talk about some different forms of sustainable energy that could be included, but you should think of some ways that you can include sustainable energy sources into your city. On to criteria number 2. Your city must include an area that helps to counter the effects of deforestation. And in case you've forgotten, deforestation is referring to the removal of large areas of trees and forests. We can see that example in the picture that's up at the top of the screen. The left side of that image is an example of deforestation, where on the right side we can see a lush green forest. And humans have removed all of the trees and vegetation from the left side of the image there. You should include an area in your city that will help to counter the effects of deforestation and basically ensure that you have some areas that include trees and vegetation somewhere within your city. On to criteria number 3. Your city must include space for people to maintain good health and well-being. So this could be demonstrated in a variety of ways. Some ideas that people have used in the past are creating some sort of interactive playground where people can use different structures to work on their physical abilities, be able to, expend some energy and use this playground. There's also ideas such as using a park to be able to walk around and use that open space as a way to maintain good health and well-being and make sure that people aren't just sitting indoors. Criteria number 4, your city must include a school that promotes quality education. So you need to have a school somewhere in your city. And again, this is just an example in this image here. It doesn't need to look exactly like this. You should be designing your own schoolhouse or school building that fits into your city in some way. On to criteria number 5. Your city must include a hospital with easy access for all city residents. So you should have a hospital, and just like your school, it should be easy to get to from all areas of your city. So you need to create some sort of infrastructure, some sort of roads or bridges or walking paths, or something even more creative than that, to easily allow people to travel from wherever they might be to the hospital or school in your city. Criteria number 6, and this is where things get a little bit more interesting and also a little bit more complicated. Your city must include innovative infrastructure. So when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about things such as roads, buildings, bridges, etc. And we need to try to think of some innovative ways that we could implement those into our city. So this is where you're going to need to use some creativity. We're going to talk about some examples of innovative infrastructure after we complete this Edpuzzle video. On to criteria number 7. Your city must include at least 3 additional buildings. So we already talked about including things like a hospital, a school, and some others. You need to have at least 3 additional buildings. This is really up to you. You can decide what you want to include. Maybe you want to include a restaurant or an office building or something like that. But you should have at least 3 additional buildings in your city. Another thing to notice here, this is kind of a little bit of a sidetrack. We have some solar panels that are included on top of this building. This is a great example of how you can incorporate sources of sustainable energy into your city design just by adding solar panels into your buildings. Criteria number 8, this is our final criteria. Your futuristic city must have a creative and unique name that relates to sustainability. So in this image here, it says Sustainable Hollywood. Hopefully you are a little bit more creative than that, and you can come up with some sort of name that is somehow connected to sustainability. And again, this is just a chance for us to be creative and kind of have fun with the name of our city. So those are our 8 criteria. What we're going to talk about next are the constraints. And if you forget what that means, we're talking about the limitations for your design. And for this design challenge, we actually only have 2. So here is our first constraint. And again, we only have 2 for this design challenge. So here's the first one. Your design must fit onto the 200 by 200 millimeter work plane. Scale down your design to allow it to fit in this space. When you open a new project in Tinkercad, the work plane that you see is automatically set at 200 by 200 millimeters. So you need to make sure that your design fits onto this work plane. I know that some people prefer to enlarge the work plane because you can make it as large as you would like to. However, the larger you make the work plane, the more glitchy Tinkercad becomes. So we're going to try to keep it to 200 by 200, which means that you're going to need to scale down or basically shrink your design to make it all fit onto this work plane. Onto our second constraint, and that is time. Okay, so time is our second constraint. You will have approximately 2 to 3 hours of build time where you are actually creating your design in Tinkercad. This will be spread out over the course of about 3 to 4 classes. So we have some other activities that we're going to work on throughout this design challenge, sort of mini activities that will help us along the way. But you'll end up total with about 2 to 3 hours of build time where you're actually creating this design. That's not a lot of time for the massive amount of stuff that you need to add into your design. So if we get to the end of that 2 to 3 hours and we find that we need a little bit more time, we may extend it. But we're going to try to keep it to that 2 to 3 hours of build time. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about your designs. I'm going to go back a couple of slides here. So this example, this building is very detailed. It would probably take more than 2 to 3 hours just to create a building with this much detail. But if we look at something like this hospital, this is a much more simplistic version of a building. Even when we compare it to the school, there's a lot of complex shapes here. If we added up the total number of shapes that are used to create this design, it's a lot more than something like this hospital. So this is relatively simplistic. Since we only have about 2 to 3 hours to work on this, when you're creating your buildings, you should probably go for something a little bit closer to this style of a design where it's a little bit more simplistic rather than something like this building where we have actual windows that are placed in here and we have small trees and everything that are created to scale. This design is incredible, but because of the amount of time we have and the constraints of this design challenge, we should probably be going for something more of this style for the buildings that are included in your design. We jump back forwards here. So now I'm going to put a space in the Edpuzzle video for you to ask any questions that you might have, and we'll go through them as a class. Thanks, everybody.